Mary Jo Sharp is a former atheist who now holds a master's in Christian apologetics from Biola University and is the first woman to become a certified apologetics instructor through the North American Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. She wrote Defending the Faith, Apologetics and Women's Ministry, contributed to the apologetics anthology Come Let Us Reason, and has produced 3 DVD Bible studies with Lifeway resources. Please welcome Mary Jo Sharp.
Well, I had just finished giving a talk on the absurdity of life without God. We were discussing meaning and purpose in the universe, in a universe void of a creator. And a line of women started to form around me. They had questions. They wanted to engage. And as I looked towards the back of this group, there was one woman that was purposefully hanging back. And she was sort of short. She had dark hair. And I could see from looking at her eyes, which were red, that she had been fighting back tears through this talk. As soon as everybody cleared out, this lady came up to me and she said, I'm struggling with belief in God. You see, my son died of leukemia at 3 years old. And I don't know how to reconcile his death with what the church teaches me about the goodness of God. Her questioning lament is common amongst us humans. It's common. In fact, it's the most frequent question or objection that I receive when I go anywhere, or not just speaking, just when I'm out. I have the same experience as you. I can't go anywhere without God putting somebody there who wants to talk about Jesus. And they don't know they want to talk about Jesus. That's the thing. It's typically a situation where they're dealing with evil, or a situation where they're just dealing with life, and we end up in a great conversation. And as you heard last night, Jeff got into a conversation on the problem of evil. That was the whole conversation, was over this issue. That's because it is one of the greatest objections to the existence of God. And it has been noted for thousands of years that this is an objection that needs to be handled. In fact, there was a great philosopher in your Bible that handled this, in Ecclesiastes. If you read at the end of Ecclesiastes 3 and towards the beginning of Ecclesiastes 4, you hear Solomon lamenting as he's looking out into the world and finding that there is injustice where there should be justice, and that there is unrighteousness where there should be righteousness. He laments over the oppression of the people, that those with power oppress, and there is no one to comfort. There is no one to comfort. In fact, in his musings on the problem of evil, he ends up saying, better than those who have lived and died are those who have never existed at all. That is how bad the problem of evil is in our world. Well, Christian philosopher of our day, William Lane Craig, states it this way: the problem of evil is certainly the greatest objection or obstacle to belief in the existence of God. When I ponder both the extent and the depth of suffering in the world, whether due to mankind's inhumanity to man or natural disasters, then I must confess that I find it hard to believe that God exists. A little bit of truth-telling there, Sarah. No doubt many of you have felt the same way. Perhaps we should all become atheists. Though Dr. Craig's including a little bit of humor here with his ending statement, he expresses the importance of this objection. This objection is going to affect all of us in some way. Everyone can relate to the basic question based on the evil they have experienced in their own lives. Everyone experiences pain and suffering in various forms: physical, emotional, relational. So while a person might say, well, the argument from evil, it sounds kind of heady. Maybe it's purely academic. It's for those ivory tower guys to deal with. Actually, our experiences in this life will thrust us into having to handle this problem. We do not have the luxury of merely pontificating on the matter. We all experience evil and we'll have to handle it. So that's what we're going to do today. Today we're going to look at this matter of great importance, formerly known as the problem of evil, by exploring how we can engage it when it happens, when it comes up in our everyday conversation. So that's what we want to do today. We want to look at how every Christian can engage the objection from evil by following some steps. These are the steps we'll look at today. Now, I do want to caveat, it's the problem of evil. So though I'm going to give you some steps to take, I'm not trying to say this is the only way to handle the problem of evil, or this is the assured way to be able to handle the problem of evil in these 3 steps. I don't want to be trite with this, but I think people don't approach it, they don't engage in it because it is such a big issue, and it can be intimidating. So we're going to take these steps in order for us to be able to start with it. So let's look at refine the objection, step 1. As you're probably noticing, the objection takes so many forms. This is an objection that has just multiple ways of expressing the same basic problem. In fact, you might hear, if God is all good, why is evil in the world? Or you might hear, how can I believe God is good when my son died at 3 years old? You might hear something like that. Or when I've been diagnosed with cancer. Or as a lady said to me, when God took my husband at 42 years, my best friend, and left me here. Or you might hear, there's too much pain and suffering in the world. How can this be so if God created this world? Or more, why didn't God create a world where there is no evil? And I like Peter Kreft's version of this. He says, if God is so good, why is his world so bad? If an all good, all wise, all loving, all just, all powerful God is running the show, why does he seem to be doing such a miserable job of it? Why do bad things happen to good people? Lots of ways of saying this objection. It can even be hard to detect when you hear it. So we want to, when we hear something that sounds like the problem of evil, we want to refine the objection. So our goal is to create a digestible or an understandable form of the argument. Now, what does digestible and understandable mean? It means that both you and the person making the objection can comprehend and engage the objection. A digestible form means that both parties involved understand what we're talking about. We will attempt to get this digestible form by helping to create an environment in which, I jumped ahead there. All right, this digestible form will help us create an environment in which both parties can add to the conversation in meaningful ways. Now, to help create this environment, we want to understand how the objector understands their objection. There we go. How does the objector understand their objection? So how are we going to do this? We're going to ask questions. And you heard Jeff last night asking questions, right? That's what we're going to do. We're going to ask questions. So one of the things we need to say is, if they say, how can I believe God is good? Say, when my son died, or when this happened, or with ISIS doing so much evil. You might have to ask them what they mean by that. Okay, now, another caveat, right? That sounds pretty harsh. So one of the things you have to determine when you hear a problem of evil objection is this person grieving deeply? Right? Because if they're in great grief and suffering at that moment, your philosophical argument on the problem of evil may come across as a clanging cymbal, okay? As noise, as irritating. In fact, the lady that came up to me at the end of the conference and said that, I actually asked her, do you need a hug or are you looking for answers? And she said, I think I need both. So we hugged and talked it through. But be discerning when you go into this. You may have a grieving person. So ask questions though. What do you mean by that? Or I say sometimes, well, do you mean to say that? And then I place the objection into a clarified form. I place it into a simpler or a refined format. A format that both you and your objector understand. So here's an example. Do you mean to say that you do not understand how God can be perfectly good if an evil, such as you experienced, is present in the creation? Do you mean to say you don't understand how God can be good if an evil, such as what you experienced, is present in this creation? Or you might say, do you mean to say a perfectly good God is not compatible with presence of any evil? Help clarify, right? Help clarify the objection. You may need to follow up with, tell me what you mean when you say something is good or evil. And I frequently use this in conversation. I frequently tell people, well, what do you mean when you're saying good and evil? What do you mean by that? Tell me what that is to you. And I also follow up with, how do you know that? So what do you mean good and evil, and then how do you know that? Remember, we can't make assumptions. So part of refining the objection is not only to find out how the objector understands their objection by asking questions, clarifying it by, again, asking them more questions. Do you mean to say this? But also we need to remember we're trying to avoid assumption. Right? You're going to hear something that sounds like the problem of evil, and you might launch into a full explanation of the moral law. Right? And really, they're just like, no, I need a hug. I really just need a hug. Okay? We want to avoid assumptions. There's another kind of assumption that we make. And I say this with a great love for people, but sometimes people don't understand their own argument. They don't. Sometimes they don't know what they're saying. They're just repeating mantra, or they're repeating what they've heard from, or what they read in a book, or a quick soundbite. So it's very important to clarify and refine the argument if we care about helping people discover truth. And another reason for this, and this was mentioned last night beautifully by Sarah, we do not want to put people on the defensive. Right? We don't want to put people on defensive. Most people that I encounter go into defensive mode when they recognize a deficiency in their knowledge. Okay, especially in their knowledge or understanding of an important subject or a sensitive subject, like the problem of evil. Once they go into defensive mode, here's what happens to them. They're using all of their emotional and intellectual energy to defend themselves. They're feeding the defensiveness. That's where their energy is going, rather than thinking clearly through the issue. We want to free them up from that so that we can have a real conversation on the problem of evil. We want to free people to think, not shackle them into towing a philosophical party line. But many times, the terms that we're using, that's the cause of the problem in communication. It's our terms we're using. Terms can be used ambiguously without a person even knowing they're doing so. So therefore, the next step we need to take is to define the term we're using. What is evil? When someone makes an objection to the existence of God using evil as the basis for that objection, they are making an assumption that evil is real. Think on that one for a moment. If a person objects to the existence of God based on the existence of evil, that person has a belief in that evil has some form of existence. Let me give you an example away from our argument. For example, if you're making an argument for a certain diet fad that you're following. And I say, you know what, I'm going to make an argument against you. I'm going to say, I don't believe your diet works because of the overwhelming amount of refined sugar in your diet. Well, I'm assuming refined sugar exists, right? You see, the basis of the objection here is that evil is real, that evil exists. It's not illusory. It's not an illusion. It's not a delusion. It's real. For how can an objection from evil be genuinely made if there's no real evil? Right? The objection uses evil as a real thing. Therefore, as Christian philosopher Douglas Groothuis says, to make the objection to God on the basis of a presence of evil, a person must sufficiently explain the existence and nature of evil. So to make the objection, we need to sufficiently explain the existence of evil. All right. At this point, things can get a bit frustrating if you're actually having this conversation, right? So I'm going to suggest asking at this point in the conversation, do you mind or would you like to discuss a definition of evil with me? Right? Instead of just launching into it, where are they at? Always checking on them to see that they're understanding what you're getting at. So would you be willing to discuss the definition with me? And then I'm not offering up my, I'm sorry guys. There we go, I got it. All right, so let's discuss the definition. All right, discussing the definition of evil. You may want to ask the other person for a definition first, right, before launching into it. Because I actually find that interesting. What do they think evil is? So I would suggest, it's a recommendation, that you ask them first. I suggest that in order for us to understand what is evil, after asking them what they think it is, I'll offer that in order to understand what is evil, I think we need to understand what is good. In order to understand what is evil, I think we need to understand what is good. In fact, one of the reasons to believe guys here, Kenneth Samples, in his book, Without a Doubt, he has a great way of explaining this. He actually says that the two concepts of good and evil are inextricably tied to each other. For evil has a parasitic relationship to good. And he's relying on some of the arguments from St. Augustine. St. Augustine said, there can be no evil where there is no good. Evil is not a thing in of itself. It has no substance of its own. Evil is a privation or a corruption of some good thing, something that should be there and is not. Evil is a privation or a corruption of good. Evil does exist in that it's a real corruption of something good. So it could be a physical corruption. It can be a moral corruption. It can be corruption of substance, corruption of relationships, when things go bad between people, and this is not how the relationship should go. So it can be these corruptions. But that's what evil is. It's a privation of a good thing that should be there. And now what we need to do, as we're talking about this evil parasitically related to good, we don't know what evil is unless we know what good is. So now how do we know what good is? We need a standard of goodness. For objective evil to exist, objective good must exist as well. Why? As I've said, how do we know what is not good if we don't know what is good? That is, in order to argue something is evil, we must know what is good. We must be able to discuss a standard for that knowledge. The standard would provide us with how we know something is good at all times, something we can look to compare and say, this is how I know. For instance, we use this language all the time. We'll say things like, she died too young. Okay, she died too young. We're inferring a standard in that statement. about the length of a person's life. We mean to say there's a length of life that is good, and there is a length of life that is not good. And we must have some idea of what is a good length of life in order to recognize there's something that's not a good length of life. Thus, you see that parasitic relationship. As philosopher Doug Groothuis explains, that while a person or event may be really evil, that evil could not have existed without some prior good or original good. So now we need to find what's that standard of goodness that we keep using to fulfill our definition. Now, what I mostly hear when I'm talking to people, they haven't thought on this. I'm just going to prep you. Some people do. If you encounter a philosopher from Stanford or something like that, you're going to have somebody's thought on this. Okay? But the average person in the street, it doesn't walk around going, how do I know it's good? Right? They're not Plato. They're not wandering around like Socrates asking, corrupting the youth of Athens. All right, so most people make arguments that assume objective goodness or a standard of goodness exists without giving a basis for how they know anything is good at all. They assume it. Okay? You hear that all the time. She died too young. They've got a standard of goodness in there. They don't even know it. Right? There's a length of life that's good. There's a length of life that's not good. We say things like this all the time. We're using a standard of goodness. Now, we've established that to object to God's existence based on the problem of evil, we must believe that evil is real, and we must have a standard of goodness. Since evil is a corruption, it's not a thing in itself. So now we're in currently need of discovering a standard of goodness. We need to find what that is. At this point in the conversation, I'm going to check a few things. First, do you understand me so far? Because remember, people don't think on this. They don't know. They don't look for a standard of goodness on a daily basis. They don't think about this. So do you understand me? Do you understand what I'm talking about? That's important, right? We don't want to just barrel on through to get through our points and leave them behind because they have no idea what we're talking about. And then I ask them if they have any concerns or questions, right? Because, as you heard from Sean last night, our society is becoming more relativistic. And as they become more relativistic, you talking about a standard of good that's always good, they're saying, well, no, I mean, every individual decides what's good. As Disney has taught us, follow your heart, right? Thank you, Disney. Oh, I go to Disneyland and I love it, but that is so in their themes of their shows, right? We find that follow your heart. It's what each individual believes. So we're battling that. When you talk about a standard that they're always accountable to, they may be looking at you like, well, I have some concerns about that. So ask them. And then ask them if they have any idea where they can find a standard of goodness. Where can you find a standard of goodness? Right? What would be a way that we can know that something is a standard of goodness? Like, where does it come from? And I typically get about 3 responses to this. One is that, and I recently got this, is that goodness is an evolutionary concept. It's based in human instinct for survival. Okay? I get that answer. And though I don't have time to treat that argument, let me tell you who did and did it wonderfully. C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. I would highly recommend that book. If you haven't read that book, it's phenomenal. We do it every semester in logic, so the Abolition of Man. And then I get, another one I get is what I just described from Sean's talk. Every individual decides for themselves. And of course, Sean did beautifully at showing you how that blows up, because then you have like Nazi Germany that are committing genocide, and we can't say anything about that, right? So it's not a standard. It blows up. Anybody can do whatever they want. And then I've actually had people tell me there is no standard of goodness. Okay, remember, we're talking about evil, right? There's no standard of goodness. Okay, well, then how do I know it's good and evil? And you start to see, like, this is not going the direction I thought it was going in their eyes. And you say, wait a minute, what's your objection? It's from evil, right? But how do we know what? We don't know what evil is. So you really have no objection here. There's no good and evil. You have no objection from evil. All right. So at this point in the conversation, check and make sure that they understand you. Ask them if they have any questions. If they have responses, you might have to do some homework. Figure out, like, read The Abolition of Man. Then finally, can I tell you why I believe Christianity offers an objective standard of goodness and why it further explains the presence of evil as well as an answer to the problem. So that next step is outlining your view. So I'm going to outline my view. And when people tell me, Mary Jo, how do you get into so many conversations about the gospel? I say, good and evil. I always talk about good and evil. How do we know what's good? How do we know what's evil? And you know what? It ends up leading right into what Christians believe. So the goal for this step is the expression of the Christian worldview regarding evil. Now I'm going to give you my example of how I would go through it. This is not a set follow through and response kind of thing. You can do your own version of it, but this is usually the way it goes for me. I'll say something along the lines of God is our standard of goodness. Why? As Douglas Groothuis explains, biblical theism claims God as the source of goodness, all goodness, on the basis of God's character and moral will. His moral will is based in his unchanging nature, his changeless nature. He says the triune God who has existed from eternity in a relationship, a threefold love between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, cannot, for example, morally mandate rape because God's disposition forbids it. Okay, his disposition forbids it. His integrity abhors it. And he says objective moral values, according to the Bible, are not created in the sense that the contingent universe was created out of nothing. Objective moral values have their source in the eternal character, nature, and substance of a loving, just, self-sufficient God. Just as God does not create himself, so he does not create moral values. They're eternally constituent of his being. In fact, his moral perfection, as a side note, is one of the reasons he's worthy of rational human worship. Side note, okay. You might say, I'm not going to quote that to somebody. I can't even write that down fast enough. All right. But you might say something like this: the goodness of God means that God's the final standard of good, and that all that God is and does is worthy of approval. Or you might say, we're making it smaller each time. You might go with Jesus, who just says, no one's good but God. I love that. No one's good but God alone. You can go with Jesus, right, from Luke 18:19. So God, being perfectly good, made a perfectly good creation. This is where I want to go. First, God's the standard, because he himself is perfectly good. Then I say, you know what? God made a perfectly good creation. We see this in Genesis 1. Thank you for setting me up, Hugh. We see this in Genesis 1, specifically in 26 and 31. He makes a value statement on it that his creation is very good. And in our conversation aspect, I'm going to attend to that part of his good creation, which is freedom, the free will of man. Groothuis further explains that man is naturally good. I think that's interesting, in accordance with God's original creation, but he is historically and presently fallen, sinful, and depraved. You see, man has used his free will to do very bad things. And then I take him back and I say, you remember evil being a corruption of good? Evil is a privation where there's a good thing. It's a privation of that. It's a corruption of it. Right? Free will has been very badly used. It's been corrupted. And where there should be a good free will, a goodness of that use of freedom, we have corrupted that. We call that evil. Now, the interesting thing here is that the discontinuity between that original creation, that it was good, but man used it for bad. In fact, we call that the fall, his fallen status, means that there's actually hope for a recovery. The discontinuity between originally good and current fallen status gives us hope. There's hope for recovery because it means man has not always been this way. It means that man has not always been this way. And it means this is not just the way things are. It's not just the way things have to be, right? Our defects are not hardwired. They are not inescapable. We've all been talking about Richard Dawkins today. Not all of us, but several of us. So let me tell you, he likes to say we're dancing to the music of our DNA. That sounds really nice. I'm a musician, so I like, anything that has to do with music. But you know what that means? I have to tell my classes, that sounds good until you break it down. That means that the singer sings and the painter paints. But it also means the murderer murders and the rapist rapes. And it just goes on until everything dies out. Now, though everyone will die, notice that this is not God's intent for his good creation of man. And people seem to have this aversion to death as well. They seem to understand that death seems to be something that's not good. It also angers and gives Jesus sorrow. It brings him great sorrow. Christians like to tease about the shortest verse in the Bible. Well, in the English anyway. It's Jesus wept. What's that story about? He's weeping and he's angry over the loss of a friend. God himself is grieving at the death of one of his creation. That's what that short passage is about. We can see that this is not the way things are supposed to be. And it matches with our own experience of life. It matches the reality of this universe. Death being that ultimate enemy to humans. That's because death is a consequence of evil. In fact, Romans 6:23, we've used it in the past as part of the Roman road, but it says the wages of sin is death. The fruit of our evil is destruction. It's death. It's corruption. It's privation. Where there should be life, there is now death. That is the problem of evil right there. Right? The wages of sin is death. But what does God do in the Christian faith? What is our great unique story? He doesn't just leave it like this. He doesn't just leave us with no hope for mankind. He provides hope. And he does that by defeating evil. He defeats evil. He defeats the consequence of evil, which is death. And how do you defeat death? Life. You defeat death through life. That's exactly what he did with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He defeats the consequence of our evil. He reverses it. He turns it around. How does he do this? By becoming, he enters our world, lives as a poor man, suffers the full consequences of evil and pain. That's Lou Marcos. He's a colleague of mine at Houston Baptist University. He suffers the full consequences of evil and pain, defeats evil and suffering by going through it to find that hope on the other side. The ultimate defeat of evil is the victory over death found in Jesus' resurrection. I love how scholar Gary Habermas says that Jesus' resurrection is an example of victory over death. It's an actual example of the victory over death. And by victory, I mean to say death is overturned. It does not have finality. The historical nature of the resurrection does several things for us as Christians. It shows us that evil is real. Evil's a real enemy. Your suffering is real. It's not a delusion. It shows us that evil is not the way things are supposed to be. We're not supposed to be like this. This is not how God intended. The corruption of life, the evil that is death, has been answered by God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians 15:26, he says the last enemy to be put down is death. You see, the resurrection is the example of the redemption of God's good creation that will take place for everyone. For everyone. And Jesus is the first fruit of that resurrection. He's how we know what's going to happen, because we've already seen it. In fact, Jesus says this I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And as William Lane Craig says, so paradoxically, even though the problem of evil is the greatest objection to the existence of God, at the end of the day, God's the only solution to the problem of evil. If God does not exist, take this in as you're talking about the problem of evil. If God does not exist, then we are lost without hope in a life filled with gratuitous and unredeemed suffering. God is the final answer to the problem of evil. He redeems us from evil and takes us into the everlasting joy of an immeasurable fellowship, immeasurable good, a fellowship with himself. So in review, how do we talk to people about this? We refine the objection because people come at you in so many different ways with this. We define the term, and then we outline the view, right? Outline your view. And by doing that, you can help people understand there is hope. We don't have to be this way. We don't have to have unredeemed suffering. It's not just the way things are. Bad things happen. It can never be put right. That's not the end of the story. It's not hopeless. There is hope in Jesus Christ. And on that note, I want to pray with you before, and as Glenn, if you would come on out. Father, thank you so much for who you are. Glorious, majestic creator of the universe. The being who can create stars and yet loves every one of us so much. Father, I pray today for our audience for everyone here as we're gaining an understanding about who you are and the evidences and the wonder of your creation, that we also reflect on the wonder of just a single human being and how valuable and immeasurable they are in worth and value. And I pray that no matter where we've come from, no matter what we're dealing with, that we remember that one thing. You died for us. You redeem us because what you made was good. It was very good. Father, thank you for that. Thank you for your great love of us. Father, thank you for this conference. Thank you for these souls that have come to learn about you. I pray they will be emboldened, that they will be more naturally Christian, that they'll be able to just talk to people anywhere at any time. And Father, I pray that this knowledge will end up disrupting their life. That, Father, you put people in their path at every corner. That you put people along their way that just want to talk to them about Jesus. And Father, it's Jesus we thank you for. We thank you for that work on the cross and that great hope. And it's in his name I pray. Amen.